right, welcome everybody. I'm hoping that you can hear me. And looks like we're live, we're all good. I see a few people here, see Daniel, Yerting, see you as well. Give me a confirmation in the chat if you can hear me. If the audio is good, I'd appreciate that. Cool, yes, all right. I see Travis, I see Carrie is here, Yusuf is here. Jack, see you, Devraj, Kristen, Anirudh, Gillian. Good, I feel good, you're all here. All right. So today is a bit of an experiment. Kristen, see you here as well. Rio, Chen, Sev. Today is a bit of an experiment. I thought we should end with a new beginning, a new way of kind of connecting. And so tonight the lecture is going to be live streamed, and I'm really glad that you're here and that you're active in the chat. It's good energy. In a way this is the end, in a way it's just a stepping stone, because of course, though this is the last lecture of this sequence, you're going to be going on next semester into part 3. Not with me, unfortunately, but with Eric Gonoyu. Jose, I see you there as well. So we're going to meet again tomorrow, as usual, to really talk through the final part of your own researches, your histories of futures. And it's really the future part that we're going to think about today in this lecture, but also when we meet tomorrow. It's going to be our last moment together before our last session next week, in which we'll have our kind of symposium sharing event down in Space 5. And the coda, this kind of end piece, is really the springboard to finally conceptualize the future part of your history. You know, we started this process on the basis that every history has a future and every future has its history. So we're looking forward today to think about how can we connect the histories that we've been looking at to the futures that issued from them. So also chronologically, if you think we were working with the chronology from 1492 to 1918 or thereabouts, today we come up right to the end of that timeline, and we look at what was happening at the end of the 19th century, specifically as a moment when the idea of the modern first emerged in a major way within architecture. And coincidentally with the idea of the modern, the idea of the new, the explicit articulation of the necessity to break with tradition, to establish a new art, a new architecture, and to see what came out of that. So that's where we're beginning. Let's get straight in. All right. Just give me a little test on the chat. Let's see, I'm hoping that the chat is going to show up in our interface here. So just send us a quick message, a hi, a wave, anything, and we'll see if that pops up on screen. I'm hoping it's going to show up somewhere over on the left-hand side. Yes. All right, Nicholas, you're first on the board. Amal, Travis, cool. You're all there. All right. So feel free, a little bit of chat periodically is going to make me feel like you're all still there. So that's good. All right. Now, looking at our matrix, I kind of could have put a green box around everything, because today is going to touch on a bit of everything. We're going to start with embodiment. Again, we're going to look at certain decolonial aspects, we're going to look at the tectonic, but we're also going to look at terrestrial, ecological, and for sure we're going to look at the futuristic. This is a kind of synthesis. And we could have begun really at many points on the board as it exists already. But I wanted to just pick up maybe on our studies of nomadic architecture. Not really for the nomadism part, but just for the way in which that documentary footage presented the body as an active structural engineering element that was lending, through its presence, a dynamic vital force to the tectonics of a structure. And I want to say that the case for embodiment is that I think wherever you look in history, whatever place, whatever time, there is a culture of embodiment. And there's always a question of how that culture of embodiment plays into the way that architecture is being constructed. That is certainly true for this moment towards the end of the 19th century, when an intersection emerges between the invention of cinema. This is one of the earliest films. It's from 1895 by the Lumiere brothers in Paris. It's hand-colored film. So each of the individual negatives has been painted with watercolor to produce this color effect. Film, of course, was black and white at this moment. And what you're seeing is the American dancer Louis Fuller perform what was known and became famous as the serpent dance, or the serpentine dance. And you can see that through this elaborate embodied dress costume and through specific routines of movement, Louis Fuller was able to produce this formal language in motion. It was sculptural, it was volumetric, but it was always changing. And artists and architects of the time were mad about it in Paris, and it became one of the most well-documented and depicted cultures of performance at that moment. It made its way into graphic art. It was a subject of an extraordinary interest for photographers, and of course sculptors who were faced with this challenge of how do you translate the ephemeral, instantaneous qualities of a moving body into a solid three-dimensional object which doesn't exist in time. It's really just spatial. For architects, the question, and this is the question we're going to kind of elaborate a bit, is how does this kind of embodied vital force make its way into architecture? And one of the kind of solutions or possibilities for that we're going to explore is something that's, at least to me, that's symbolized by these images, which are not from the 1890s, they're from the 1980s. But what they're showing you is the living dynamic structural forces which are at play in an architectonic structure, even when it's ostensibly at rest. And so you may have come across photoelastic analysis in your structural classes, I'm not sure, but this is a way of, in this case, photographing perspex models of Gothic flying buttresses, which are then loaded with a weight, and they deform. And the way that the perspex deflects then changes the way that light is reflected and refracted through its surface. And that gives you this incredible picture of the dynamism, actually, of solid masonry structures. Even though they may look still and permanent, they are, in fact, they have their Louis Fuller aspect. Thank you, SCI-Arc Jack, for the flames. I see them. This culture of embodiment played out in many ways, and you may be more familiar, perhaps, with these images from this is Marais, Jules Etienne Marais, one of the very early pioneers of pre-cinematic photography, chronophotography, montaging photographs in these incredible superimposed sequences, so that before the cinematic technology was developed to run them all together into a sequence, they could be superimposed, and you could work out the movements of these dynamic bodies through space. One of the great architectural historians of the 20th century, Siegfried Giedion, published this quite amazing double spread in his well-known book, Space, Time and Architecture. And it was this diptych, or double comparison, between, on the one hand, the structural steel lattice framework of the Galerie des Machines, the Machines Gallery, an exhibitions palace, a bit like the Crystal Palace that was built in Paris in the late 19th century, and a painting by Degas of a ballet dancer. And that might seem like a kind of juxtaposition, like why should these two, this solid work of architecture and this representation of a dancer in the middle of a kind of pirouette or an arabesque, why would they be compared? Gideon's point was, or his insight was quite extraordinary. And these were basically contemporaneous in terms of their date. But what Gideon wanted to suggest is that the Gallery of Machines was standing on tiptoe in the same way, or in an analogous way, as a ballerina stands on point in the middle of a dance. And this is particularly because, if you can see right down here, the massive arches of the Galerie des Machines, they landed in the ground on pin joints. So there wasn't a fixed joint, but they were actually on rollers. So this pointed toe of the arch, for Gideon, was the architectural equivalent of the dancer's foot. And all of the grace, the posture, the performative liveness that's embodied by a dancer holding that fluttering position in the middle of a sequence, was for Gideon a new quality of the new architecture that was emerging through these new structural technologies. And they were perhaps embodied nowhere more spectacularly than in the Eiffel Tower. This raw and at that time completely unique expression of structural steelwork, whose entire form was determined by engineering, mechanics and statics, and which also, somewhat like a dancer's body, like Louis Fuller's body, provoked a kind of outrage. It sort of teetered on the verge of obscenity for its nude and bare exposure of unornamented engineering work. So these were some of what you might say the culture of embodiment that was starting to emerge in Europe at the end of the 19th century. Another space or sphere in which embodiment with its related politics was starting to, or had already started to emerge, which was also linked to the emergence of new kinds of structural engineering, and in particular new kinds of structural engineering which allowed extended spans to be produced in architecture. You remember, we've looked at the Crystal Palace, we've looked at greenhouses as new emergent typologies in which new forms of society and culture became manifest. Older typologies could also be reinvented or pushed in new directions through these technologies. And an example of that is the library. Henri Labrouste, in the middle of the 19th century, around the same time as the Crystal Palace, produced this library, which from the outside, it's a big, solid, thick, massing, heavy masonry structure. But on the inside, a new kind of public space was opened up through the use of this rather beautiful cast ironwork, which provided a very light internal structure, free of any cumbersome structural support. And what was kind of radical about this sort of building? What about the kind of space that it produced? Well, it was a very large public space that was open to anyone who wanted to come and use the library. It was a nationalized library system, and it really spoke to the emergence of a new reading public. It was a new space of assembly. It fulfilled a new role within French society, and that experiment was repeated in the Bibliothèque Nationale, this time using a really beautiful vaulted system in which an even larger reading room could be produced. These are the stacks where the books were produced at the back, and these are details of this really beautiful iron and tile work. Look, you can see the glazing of these quite beautiful ceramic tiles, which form the lightweight, thin-shelled infill in this, really exquisitely trussed arches. A lot of this sort of engineering theory had been taken from the French architect, restorer, historian, theorist Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. And these are images from Viollet-le-Duc's research, published books. None of them were buildings were built like this. And you see there's this quite weird experimental combination between solid medieval Gothic-looking masonry buildings and then these alien mutant elements, the cast iron, which free up all of this space because of their intense and dense structural strength. All of the forces and loads of these heavy structures can be channeled through that cast iron, opening up space. And this is really, here again you see it, a very large empty volume opens up because you can use this cast iron skeleton to hold up the thin-ribbed vaults. A lot of his work was in exploring how do you create new open forums in which people can gather. Same also with this domed structure. Structural engineering efficiency was at the service of producing new spaces of assembly. And a further example of that, this time in Belgium, Victor Horta's La Maison de Peuple, House of the People. The name is kind of self-explanatory. It was based around this really extraordinary meeting hall, an assembly hall, and it was a space that invited socialist politics, open debate, public discussion. It was part of the construction of a political space. And what I want to sort of propose is that at this moment there was a combination and an intersection of new engineering technologies, visionary architectural design, and emergent social political functions that were part of shifts in the overall complexion and nature of European societies at this time, to move towards a mass enfranchisement of the body politic of the population. And architects were playing instrumental roles in this by figuring out how to create spaces in which such cultures could emerge and thrive. Now, Victor Horta's building came about, 40 to 50 years after the Le Brust. And one might say, well, what were the kind of changes, what were the advancements here? Well, if we compare the metalwork, I wonder what you think you see in the difference between the structural systems. This is, it's highly ornamented. The Le Brust has a lot of this filigree type work, which is kind of distracting from the simplicity, really, of the geometry, right? Because we just have these cast iron columns and then what we would call, I think, barrel vaults, effectively semicircular barrel-shaped vaults with these trusses in between them. When you look at the Victor Horta, I think you can see there's a much more complicated attitude to structural members. They're more like webbed. They're extremely curvaceous, and the geometry is not, simple, regular circles, semicircles, straight lines. We've like vegetalized. Something has become like more arboreal, more vine-like. And this is indeed because there was, during this time, the 1890s, in France and Belgium in particular, a new turn towards a new nature. That is let's look here at Hector Guimard's designs, realized constructions for the Paris metro system, in which really a new formalism emerges, a new family of forms that don't really have a precedent in the history of style in architecture. They're recognizable because they're so closely drawing upon natural forms, sinews, marine forms, skeletons, mineral formation. One writer on this kind of architecture, Nicholas Pevsner, wrote about the long, sinuous curve, reminiscent of lily stems, an insect's feeler, the filament of a blossom or occasionally a slender flame, the curve undulating, flowing, and interplaying with others, sprouting from corners and covering asymmetrically all available surfaces. The same kind of vitalism that was animating the dress, the serpentine dress and fabrics and body of Loie Fuller when she danced, was making its way into these sort of living sinews, plant-based, insectoid sinews and musculatures of these new kinds of structure. And indeed, the fact that this seemed to be the emergence of a stylistic world that had no real precedent in the history of architecture stylistically, the name, or one of the names that emerged to name it was Art Nouveau, new art, signifying this break with the past. And this translated also into house design and architecture in a very direct way. In Belgium especially, the work of Victor Horta in the Van Eetvelde house, you see in the interior courtyard that it's almost like difficult to distinguish between what is architecture and what is actually garden. What's a living stem, what's a real plant, and what is structural steel or iron. You see that this was quite a long site plot, and a large portion of it was given over to this hexagonal atrium type space. You see the use of very thin glass plating for the roof to bathe the whole thing in light. That was also the subject of decoration. Plant forms again were rendered in coloured stained glass. The railings, cast iron or wrought iron, they took on the form also of tendrils and blossoms and plant forms. So this was a highly experimental new way of dealing with form. But I also want to say, or kind of challenge us to read this not only in terms of an autonomous language of form, but also of a history and a politics. And to do this, I'm going to draw on the work of Deborah Silverman, who is an art historian actually in LA at UCLA. And Silverman published this very powerful essay, which you may have looked at for this week, Art Nouveau, Art of Darkness. And it's a text which sets itself the task of connecting these forms of highly decorative architecture to the broader political and ecological and colonial contexts in which this work emerged. And I should say, a kind of jumping off point for this and the strong rationale is that the what's it called, Van Eetvelde house was a house that was commissioned from Horta. Am I here? Okay. By the way, if I cut out or something, please put it in the chat, because otherwise I'm going to be speaking into the void. I heard a bleep, but I think I'm still plugged in. I think the audio is still good. Van Eetvelde was the cool. Thanks, Daniel. Nice. Van Eetvelde was, I forget his exact title, but he was like commissioner for the Belgian Congo. He had a high administrative position in the administration of the Belgian colonization of Central Africa. And so the money that was paying for Art Nouveau, that was funding these experiments in architecture, was coming directly out of the Belgian colonial project. And what Silverman challenges us to do is to see the connection, to hold that connection in our minds. And I think you only need to take one look at this botanical illustration of wild rubber vines from the Belgian Congo to see that there is something suspiciously familiar in this formal language of the vine. The wealth that was being produced for the colonial elite in Belgium in large part derived from rubber. Rubber was a massive 19th century industrial discovery. All of its present-day applications were emerging in this time, and the state of Congo was the site where this rubber was grown and harvested to a massive extent. This is an extremely in-depth academic article, and it goes through its argument really carefully. And I just want to kind of pick out a few moments from it here and sort of encourage you, if you ever would wish, to read this in detail for its examination. I'm going to skip over a lot here. But again, you see, just how large the visual culture and the image of the colonial landscape of agriculture and exploitation made its way felt in the interiors of these colonialists' houses in the metropolitan centres. Another of the major resources which were extracted from the Congo was ivory. You see here the piles of ivory that were taken and then displayed within new museums that were specifically being constructed to house these colonial projects. In Brussels, in the capital of Belgium, the Royal Congo Museum was constructed, an entire new museum produced solely for the showing and exhibition of products from the Congo. Where I want to get to is further down here. Silverman speaks about the Art Nouveau line. I mean, I think we've seen from the examples we looked at so far that linearity is an extremely important part of the definition of this style. It's mobile and it's directional. It contains that kind of dynamic force, a line of force. And what Silverman picks up on is that this meant that the style also came to be known as the whiplash style. And, obviously, and for her, this idea of the whiplash is what evokes extremely explicit images of, where was it? Back up here. No, I've gone the wrong way. It's going to come back. Sorry, it's going to come back later. An extremely explicit evocation of the fundamental punitive violence which underlies all practices of colonialism, but for which the Belgian Congo was kind of extreme. The whiplash style, it provides evidence of the rugged, relentless and sinuous coils of the rubber vines, as we've seen, but also the flogging whip, the instrument of violence, which was at the center of Leopold's rule, Leopold being King Leopold of Belgium. And you see here again in these select details this correspondence between architecture and ecology. This is the image. So this is a cartoon, a political satire critique of on the right, King Leopold, in this sort of perverse colonial fantasy hybrid of a white king with a black body holding this whip. And it's this comparison which I think clinches it for Silverman, that the serpentine line of the whip reappears in the ironwork of the Van Eytvelde house, in order to really demonstrate this fact about architecture and the colonial project, that stylistic forms of modernism, that is Art Nouveau in Belgium, expressed a displaced encounter with a distant but encroaching imperial violence, the return of the repressor in visual form. And I think this is a very powerful kind of scholarly act to show this connection between ostensibly decorative forms and the political cultural histories in which they are enmeshed through circuits of economy, terrestrial networks, construction ecologies involving materials, tectonics, labour, and so on. Now, if we switch to a different location, we can see different articulations of place, ecology, terrestriality, artisanship, and architectural design. And this is where we switch into the second half, really, of this lecture. And that's to move now to the Mediterranean, to Spain, and to the Catalan region, and to look at the work of Antoni Gaudí in particular. And Gaudí's work, like the Art Nouveau, a set of styles from Northern Europe that he became very familiar with. Like them, he was concerned with, as an architect, with designing everything, designing a whole ecology of space, really, down to the coat pegs and door handles. And I mean, in collaboration with an extensive artisan workforce, you see that every surface, every component of the building became unified as part of the same architectural project. Picture frames, screens, gateways, interiors. There was really no separation between the work of the architect, the interior designer, the decorator, the carpenter, the plasterer. All of these art forms were being unified in a single and totalizing, unifying design practice. And so this produces, really extraordinary continuities of space and conception. So that area, the staircase flowing into the dining room, the parlors, the interstitial spaces, there's an entire spatial conception which is pulling all of these arenas together, including the way that the chairs and the mirrors are all modeled and fashioned. And I think you can see, again, this use of natural motif and analogy. And part of what this means is a total lack of standardization. When you look at the floor plans, which are so amazing, they're like, I feel they're like cellular diagrams, like as if we were looking at kind of slides of microscopic sections of cellular development, or like flesh or plant life. But you see no right angles, no straight edges, no two spaces are the same. This building looks like it has, grown through mitosis. It's extremely adventurous in its deployment of curvatures. And I think, you see here Gaudi's Casa Mia building in the middle of, what is a really rigidly gridded urban situation in Barcelona. This sinuous curvaceousness stands out massively. The roofscape with this undulation, with the sculptural chimney pieces. The level of irregularity also means that effectively these are conceived in plastic totality, meaning although they can be sliced into plan and section, these flat drawing interfaces are effectively inadequate for dealing with the three-dimensional complexity of this artifact. So it's been conceived like a piece of sculpture from every point of view, all over in 3D. And so the surfaces become, this building had a nickname, I forget the Catalan, but called the Quarry, because it looks like something that has been sculpted out of a sheer rock face, a cliff, or that it's been eroded by a natural process of weathering. And you see here, in the balconies and the fenestration, a really rough and weathered, eroded surface. Similarly, in the Casa Batlló, look at the way that facade is kind of rippling, just like a skin on a body, as if there's musculature pushing against an epidermis. And these fish mouths, shark jaw, skeletal orifices, the curvature, you see it doesn't really come out in section. The section doesn't look all that weird. But when you look at plan and you start to cut through those walls and surfaces, one is starting to look at something like a vivisection, as if one's cutting through a body. one could make a claim, maybe, that this was an early form of augmented reality. And what you're seeing here is from this year a work by Rafik Anadol, who you guys may know, who does a lot of AI projection-based work, has done work in LA. And this was an augmented projection on the Casa Batlow done at night, in which that facade is like further dematerialized. And this is where I think the idea of augmentation comes in, is that the kind of natural or standardized formal properties of solid materials like rock, stone, glass, wood, metal, through sculptural acts of manipulation and mutation, become dematerialized. And this time through, digital projection. And the drawings of this become, pretty phenomenal. But I think it's working in a similar vein to Gaudi's own practice, which was in many ways that of a sculpture. One of his near contemporaries wrote of him that he finds in nature the rules and guidance that should define and govern the architectural elements. The roof is like a mountain and has ridges and slopes. The vaulting is like a natural cave of parabolic section. The more resistant parts of the soil form shelves projecting over the eroded sides. He observes the profusion of enveloping warped surfaces and the smoothness of transitions from one natural ground or rock form to the next one. So we're seeing here a sculptural, natural, geological language of form and colour, which is treating architectural surface, both sculpturally and biomimetically. This is one of the great passages where the facade of the building has been sculpted to resemble a basket. This, blew my mind. Apparently this like dimpled, wrinkled skin is representing incense smoke. And wait, I'm feeling like I'm seeing some chat. For some reason, why my chat is not showing up for me in my window? But I see chat on my other screen. But I'm figuring that someone's gonna shout out if you can't hear me. Why is my chat not working? I'm just gonna hang on here because I want to know. Oh, okay, Travis. Cool, I can see. I see some stuff in the Twitch interface chat that's not coming up on my screen. Cool, all right, you can hear me. Cool, thanks Youssef, thanks Jake, Jack, Travis, nice. Maybe that's spam, I don't know. Anyway, incense smoke. This is part of a cathedral facade in which he has tried to turn it into smoke with nodules. Smoke, basket, scales, knobbly bits. The articulation of a form, like nothing can be flat, nothing can be straight, nothing can be rectilinear. But why? Because nothing in nature is like that. If they're going to be columns, they should be columns like leeks or tree branches, because in nature, that is how stuff grows. This is the architect working as a sculpture, one in which the surface is being looked at not just as structure, but as a volume in light that's played by the elements, by the passage of the sun, and it responds to that. Architecture becomes a mountain, it becomes a cave, it becomes a forest. It wants to take on all of the qualities of the vegetal, the geological, even the atmospheric. Part of this this formalism, and I think this testifies to Gaudi's really voracious vision, that he's willing to see anything and incorporate it. And one thing that's been said is that these oil jars, which were produced locally in the Catalan region, their globular volumetric forms form part of Gaudi's inspiration, but especially the nearby mountain ranges. And I think it's really clear here that Gaudi is trying to produce a resonance and interdependence between architectural form and geological form. The references proliferate. Skeletal, rib cage, shell, the biomorphic appears and reappears in Gaudi's architecture, more ribs here. Nature is being mined for its, but I want to say its a-stylistic qualities. Part of this idea of breaking with the past is discovering new sets of forms. And this is where I think Gaudi was excelling. The point is that Gaudi also was operating as an advanced engineer, because part of what interested Gaudi in the exploration of natural form was its engineering qualities, its physical computation. And here you're looking at some of the columns and supports in a park project that he worked on in Barcelona, Park Güell, in which these forms are you could say arborealized. They take after the nature of trees, but they're also, this is another example in a chapel that was in that park. What's the fascinating thing about these columns? Not only do they kind of look crazy and weird and sculptural, but they're not straight. And this was one of Gaudi's major findings, was that in order to most efficiently channel the load of a structure, columns could and often should be put at an angle. And this is a drawing. This is based sort of a cleaned up version of a drawing that Gaudi himself made, calculating the vectors, the force vectors, which determined the static equilibrium of the structure. And that was achieved by channeling the lines of force through these tilted columns and masses. And yeah, this is, quick sort of attempt at an engineering analysis / lesson, which is, this is a set of diagrams going through sort of historical structures, early simple church-based system, where everything is going down straight vertically onto the columns with no thrust moving to either side. With the Gothic, when you start to use arches, arches push weight outwards. And so that means that the force suddenly is not going down vertically, it has to be contained. And this extra thrust, which is represented in these arrows pushing outwards, is taken care of by the buttress. And in classic Gothic architecture, that meant you needed to stick a whole buttress on the side of a building to stop it falling over, to stop all the forces pushing the walls out and making the columns collapse. Gaudi's work was to try to do away with the buttress and to try and make all of the force come directly down through the structural elements, which meant he had to put them at an angle, and that obviated the need for flying buttresses. That meant that there was no need for a flying buttress. Now, part of Gaudi's further experimentation involved a return to this. And I mean, maybe let's ask this question. So this is something you can respond to in the chat, because this is I feel like this is an important structural engineering architectural question. These show diagrams by Robert Hooke, really early, like 17th century engineer. And they demonstrate the principle of the inverted arch. And this was the idea that this is a hanging chain, and then it gets reflected. You see, this shape here is reflected in this shape above. One is a chain, one is an archway. Can anyone say on the chat what forces are active in the chain and what forces are acted in the arch? Put it in the chat. What do you think? What kind of force is operating in the chain, and then alternatively, what kind of force is acting in the arch? See if you can draw on your structures knowledge or have a guess. Yes, tension and compression. Tension for the chain. Yeah, gravity, yes, it's definitely gravitational. Compression for arch and tension. So those are exactly the right answers. And just one sort of extra piece is that it's perfect tension in the chain and perfect compression in the arch. So everything here is in tension. Naturally hanging from works perfectly upside down, yes. So this means that everything is in tension, because a chain can't sustain any compression. It's loose. Whereas when you just invert that shape, everything is in perfect compression. And that's good, because if you've got it in tension, it's hard to manage, because it's going to be pushing out sideways. This, like, how is this for a physical model? This is a hanging chain model of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral. A really extraordinary technique of form finding. And you can see we're looking at it upside down here, but you see there's a board, and then screwed to the board are all of these chains, these wire chains with small connections. And then what's pulling the chains down are these little bags of lead shot, so little granules of lead, and that's pulling down, pulling on the wires and creating the forms. And this again is this model also uses cloth, and it's using the cloth, the wire and the weight to physically compute the complex curvature of the catenary parabolic arches which constitute the structural system. And then if you flip that photograph, then you get a representation of what the thing would look like when it's turned from everything being in tension to everything being in compression. If everything's in compression, then you can build it out of stone, because stone is good for compression. Not so good in tension, as you know. These drawings, so I read, are traced over the top of photographs of those hanging models. So I think this is a cool workflow that Gaudi had going on here, to do the hanging models, to do the physical computation, then flip it, and then start sketching over the top to build up these extremely atmospheric interiors as well as the exteriors, in which, you know, these mutant forms are starting to be produced. This is what the site now looks like. This is an older photograph. You know, Gaudi began this project in the 1880s. He passed away in 1926 with a lot of it still unbuilt, but a lot of drawings and a lot of plans, and that is what continues to be produced up to this day by new architects and engineers following and interpreting Gaudi's plans. Now, one of the people who was fascinated by Gaudi's work and used it as the basis to develop and extol new theories on art and life was the Spanish artist and provocateur Salvador Dali. And you may have seen in, where is it here? In the reading for this week, this essay by Gaudi, this essay by Dali on Gaudi, the vision of Gaudi. And, you know, what's interesting about the way that Dali structures this is that he does it through the five senses. And he begins by thinking about touch. And Dali was an interesting and unusual character, and I think it's interesting to read him as a way to sort of provoke oneself as a writer, how you can write about architecture, the viscerality and the embodiedness that you can bring in to your writing, and to treat the writing as a way to stage your own kind of feelings and responses here. And Dali I like because it's very visceral. He speaks about the importance of touch, the bony structures, the living flesh of his delirious ornamentation. He also makes a point that Dali's art and work is a popular art. It draws on popular feeling, on folklore, and that it contains or responds to or provokes all sensory elements. His brain is well aware of the tips of his fingers. He creates surfaces of goose flesh. Everything is bristling with texture, a tactile erogenous zone which bristles like a sea urchin. And I like this, this totalizing perception, which is able to bring together and to sustain multiple associations and resonances. You know, Dali is really alive to Gaudi's polychromatic treatment of surface, but he's also interested in acoustics, the sounds of bells. This is a multimedia art form which responds to all of the senses in order to produce, you know, the highest intensity of affective feeling, even including the smell. One must be capable of breathing its sacred perfume. I think this idea of what is the perfume of the building, what is its scent, what is its touch, and treating it, you know, in this embodied way as something that you can respond to with as much detail and sort of care and sensitivity as you might respond to another body. I think potentially it has a lot of consequences for even the ethics of how we interact with each other in space. Dali was a provocateur. His writing is evocative but he wasn't content really just with the act of writing without performance, without some mode or method of bringing it to the people in a spatially site-specific manner. So this is Dali giving a lecture by live action painting a picture of Sagrada Familia in the middle of this performance. Now, to kind of explain exactly what is going on here, we need to just look a bit further at another piece of an interview with Dali. But in advance of that, I want to know if anyone would like to just take a stab at kind of guessing this. Here we are. We see Dali posing on the roof of La Pedrera, the Mia apartments. La Pedrera is Catalan for the quarry. Quick quiz before we read the Dali. What is it, do you think, about Dali's own method of self-fashioning, the way that he has produced and presented himself, which is connecting him physically and directly with the architecture of Gaudi? What do you see about Dali's self-fashioning, which is architectonic? Let us know in the chat. Cool mustache. That is the right answer straight away, Jack. Let's. All right. In an interview with Gaudí after his performance, the question was asked: ¿Tiene alguna relación el bigote de Dalí con el arte de Gaudí? El bigote, the mustaches. Is there any relationship between Dali's mustaches and the art of Gaudi? And look at what he says. There is a big relationship, because my mustaches are absolutely contrary to the mustaches of the North, the depressive ones like those of Friedrich Nietzsche, which fall. They sag. Whereas his kind of rise up like music. His mustache is erect, like the towers of the Siquetes de Valle or las Torres de Gaudi. His mustaches are erect, like the towers of Gaudi. And what he's referring to here in the, forgive me, I don't know the correct Catalan pronunciation of the Siquetes de Valls, which is this performance, which is a popular, oh wait, you can't see it, hang on. What you see in the background here of Dali's lecture is this popular folkloric kind of game festival competition in which the competitors make these human towers. And I think this is, we think back to like Louis Fuller, the dynamism of embodiment. This for Dali was like a human embodiment and manifestation of the structural integrity and vital aliveness of the towers of the Sagrada Familia, and indeed Dali's own bigotes, that they embodied this upward, elevated, living impulse, which was embodied in architecture. I want to say that Dali was visionary because he was of the connections he was able to produce between things that were distant but whose relationship felt right. This method of association, I think, is one of the great creative acts and bases of architectural history, and it's this elastic movement between the present and the past in order to create new affiliations and new strategic relationships, which is really what I think I'm interested in architectural history, and which I see happening in your own work, and I'm trying to kind of model here. So to close out, this is the final gesture, and it's the final kind of returning point for us. Remember that we began way back, whenever it was, 12, 13 weeks ago, by considering our relationship to our own site, to LA, to the place that we're in. And so I want to end by proposing a relationship where we can kind of begin to return back and bring ourselves via Dali and Gaudi back to LA and where we find ourselves now. And this is the vector of that. Of that connection. So what you're seeing here is footage from a couple of decades ago from the city of Nolla in southern Italy. Another coordinate on the Mediterranean geography that is not so far away from Barcelona and Catalonia, where Dali was, and you're seeing a performance of a festival at Nola, in which different groups of the community, they band together in order to produce these towers. They're called gigli, lilies. And these towers, they're made up of wood, papier-mâché, and they're held on the shoulders of the locals who dance them down the street. There's a whole load of them. It's kind of competitive, and you see here how the tower is balanced on the shoulders of the participants. And so they bounce it up and down, walking it through the piazzas. And then they all end up in the square. So it's a truly embodied, popular, folkloric, performative, architectural, kind of festival-based act that is bringing people together in public space into this fundamentally upward, vertically oriented, positive, affirmational, collective practice. This festivity had its roots, way back, and this is from the 19th century, showing the different towers. Well, it was from the town of Nola in southern Italy that Simon Rodier, the architect of the Watts Towers, came from. And it's widely thought that Rodier, when he came to the States from southern Italy as an immigrant child, that he may have carried the memory of the Gigli di Nolla in his mind. And when he set about in 1921, over a 30-year period, to start single-handedly constructing El Nuestro Pueblo, as he called what we refer to as the Watts Towers, our city, single-handedly, day by day, over 30 years, was he carrying that memory of the Gigli of Nola, that collective festival architectural performance in his mind that led him to produce his own towers. And I know a few of you, in fact, are working on the Watts Towers and even on the Sagrada Familia, so this is a special shout out to you. One, the product of a visionary architect, but with a massive and extensive municipal team of artisans and workmen. The other, the product of a single man, both working for approximately 30 years, lodged and absolutely immersed in the immediate local urban context of the places that they lived, but exploring structure and form intuitively, directly, hands-on, modeling as they go, improvising structural systems and solutions, not working primarily through drawings, but living in the architecture, connecting their bodies with the structure so that they start to become part of the dynamic, formal engineering flows and dynamisms that create these fundamental public spaces. Rainer Banham in The Four Ecologies said that the Watts Towers is LA's only real public space apart from the beach. This is also a kind of reflection on how does one live with one's architecture? How does one perform and inhabit one's work. This is Gaudi's sleeping quarters and office. You know, this is where he set himself up for most of the time. He worked in bed with his models, with his drawings and tools, surrounded by all of these artifacts in his office, immersing himself in his vocation, in his work. Rodea, in his own different but I think kind of related way, had this same aspiration to raise a space up, not for his own edification, but to be a place of community and collectivity, in which the space that he had created could embrace and connect people in new ways. The journal from 1978 that published the Dali essay, it has a painting by Dali on the front. On the back, kind of mysteriously, it has this beautiful image of the Watts Towers. There isn't an article about the Watts Towers in this edition of the journal. They get mentioned very lightly at time, but I feel there's a connection here. There's a world which is still yet to be fully explored. So this is really where I want to leave it for today and for this semester, which is to think about the ways in which architecture can create these linkages, these new trajectories, that it can draw affinities and set up relationships, maybe where you don't expect them, where you have to look a little bit to find them, or maybe even where they've been erased or neglected in the past due to systems of privilege or unequal visibility. Part of our work, I think, can be to re-establish new connections, and from those histories, from that historical work, we can build new futures. So that's where I leave it. Hit me up in the chat to let me know that you're still here, that you made it to the end. Thank you for being here. Thanks for being part of this experiment. Yes, see you guys are there. That's good. We're going to meet again tomorrow, and I really look forward to seeing your faces and to checking in, finishing up where the projects are, and maybe if we get time, just having a chat about where we're all going to go and do next, although we're going to have more time to do that next week. So that's the end. Thanks all for being here. It's great to see you all in the chat. Really appreciate you all, and see you tomorrow. Be well in the meantime.